Hello and welcome, everyone. My name is Tristan McLaren, and I'm the Director of Physician Engagement at the Canadian Medical Association, and I'll be the facilitator for this session as we reflect on 10 years with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's calls to action. So today we'll be discussing progress, challenges, and successes, and where we still need to have an impact. So before we get started, just a few housekeeping items. We ask that once you're able to, especially once we get to the discussion portion of today's session, to please turn on your cameras. It'd be great to see some faces. And as well, we've also muted your microphones until we get to that portion, but then just ask that you can unmute yourselves to participate whenever you'd like. As well, we'd also ask that you please make sure to add your first and last name to your video so that when we get to you during the question period, we can make sure we call you by the correct name. So to do this, you can click on your video and click rename just to add your name. And finally, we are recording the plenary part of today's session today to make it available for those who couldn't attend. So I'd just like to start off in a good way by beginning with a land acknowledgement. So I want to acknowledge that I'm speaking today from Ottawa, which is located on the never surrendered homeland of the Anishinaabe Algonquin Nation, a land of spirit and purity, of healing plants and sacred waters provided to the people by Creator since time immemorial. And with great humility, we want to offer gratitude for the commitment that the Anishinaabe Algonquin have always held in keeping the Song of a Healthy Nation alive for all people of this beautiful land. So just like to invite you all to take a moment to reflect on that land that you were on, either silently to yourselves or in the chat. We're really welcoming people from all across the country in this session today. Okay, so just to move forward, today we'll be spending some time looking at the origins and goals of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's calls to action. And we'll be exploring the historical backdrop that led to its creation, the key findings related to healthcare, and see how things have progressed or still have a ways to go so far. And we'll also shine a light on positive solutions that are impacting change in healthcare and improving the health outcomes for Indigenous people. In terms of our agenda for today, in a minute, we're going to do a bit of a warm-up activity, and then we'll be diving into the TRC calls to action with a presentation from Dr. Alika Lafontaine. Before we hear from the CMA's president, Dr. Margot Burnell, on CMA's Reconciliation Action Plan and progress to date. We'll then hear from our panelists about who will share how they're making change in their respective spheres of influence. And finally, we're going to turn it to you to hear about, some of the great resources or initiatives you've encountered or solutions that are having an impact for Indigenous people before we close. And maybe I'll just note quickly that in the registration for today's event, we heard from many of you who highlighted interest in learning about the TRC calls to action, what the CMA has been doing, but also concrete actions and practical tips that you can take in your own practice or organization to bring about change. So just ask that we please keep this focus and center the needs of Indigenous people and communities and keep that in mind today. So first, before we start, just want to get a sense of who we have here with us today. So there's a few poll questions we'll just quickly go through. And first is if you could just tell us a little more about your role in healthcare. So just give us a few seconds to answer this question. Okay, so we have a mix here, physicians of practice, yeah, all across the career spectrum. So that's great. And as noted, there's another option. If you could just tell us that in the chat, it'd be great to hear from you as well. Okay, so to the next question. So for those that are, working towards allyship, you've shown an interest in attending in today's event. Could you just tell us where you or your organization are in your reconciliation journey? So you'll see some options here, well on the way, taking a few steps, still developing a plan, haven't started yet, or, to be fair, not sure how to get started. Just give a few more seconds. We'll show it when the votes when the votes stop coming in. Okay, let's show the results there. Yeah, so we really have a mix here. It looks like we have a lot in the kind of more established stage in terms of you've made a few steps, perhaps you have a plan, or strong, or in terms of you may be working with practices that you have in place that are sustainable or ongoing. So really just invite you, those of you with more experience or more insights to share, to really share those in the chat in terms of your learnings, just for the benefit of those that are here today. And lastly, one more question that we'll do, and I'll just read it aloud. For those of you who have taken a few steps or are well on your way, what advice do you have for your peers who haven't started or are unsure about how to start their journey? So you'll just pause there and see if we have any coming in. If not, I invite all of you to please just share in the chat as we go through. We'll be going through a few presentations here, so there's lots of time for sharing and asking more questions as we go ahead. Okay, so what I'd like to do is now hand it actually off to our first presenter, and that's Dr. Alika Lafontaine, who's the former CMA president and is now our Indigenous Advisor in Residence. So over to you, Dr. Lafontaine.
Thanks so much, Tristan, and it's a pleasure to meet everyone today. Thanks for taking time out of your day to chat about some reflections on TRC during this Indigenous History Month. The CMA has been moving forward with reconciliation work that's continued to get deeper and deeper over time, and it's a great opportunity today to connect with folks who are making differences in their communities, but to also reflect on how far we've gone 10 years after the release of the TRC. So we can go next slide. So the TRC is celebrating its 10th anniversary this year. In 2015, it released its final report that was the result of collecting over 6,500 survivor testimonies. And within that report, there were 94 calls to action issued, some which were specific to health and some which were related to health. And as we go through today, some of the questions that we'll be reflecting on is thinking about the calls to action and how far we've gone with actually delivering on those 10 years later, reflecting on how much still needs to be done, and talking about how we could rebuild trust and systems together. Next slide. If you go to the TRC report and are going through the calls to action, the health specific ones are items 18 through 24. These are some summaries of just what the calls to action actually speak to. You can see that the calls to action have very specific areas to focus on, and that they represent problems that we've known have been there for quite a long time. Next slide. Outside of the specific calls to action, there's also system level supports within the calls to action that you can refer to as well. Those specifically are calls to action 7, 9, and 57. So just to be comprehensive, if you review and look through the TRC calls to action, including these as well, provides a more comprehensive picture of exactly what needs to be done. Next slide. The path to the TRC actually goes back, several decades. And one of the things that I think is really important when thinking about reconciliation, especially in the last 10 years, is that the path to where we're at actually goes back several decades. In the 1990s, there was something called the Oka crisis, and the Oka crisis was triggered by a dispute over land ownership that went back to the 1970s. And there was a series of land claims that came out, and as land claims were moving through the courts, as Indigenous people had the opportunity to represent themselves, since both utilizing and training to be a lawyer as a Indigenous person was actually outlawed under the Indian Act up until 1951. People were able to exert their rights and actually utilize court systems in order to litigate treaties that in many ways had not been delivered in the way that they were supposed to. And so when the Oka crisis was triggered, it was over land use that the local First Nations had identified as part of their traditional territory. but which the town of Oka did not recognize. And it was a land standoff. It was the largest armed standoff in Canadian history, actually. And it led to a national debate over Indigenous rights because of the effect that it had on other political activities in the country. Going on at the same time was constitutional reforms during the time of all of this going on. And one of the reasons those constitutional reforms were actually rejected was because of the feelings of one First Nation politician in Manitoba uh, who felt very strongly that the government was not following through on its treaty obligations, and as a result, actually brought down the constitutional courts at the time. The government had to reflect on how to deal with this, and as a result, came out with the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples. I learned about this when I was in high school. It was an enormous document, thousands of pages long. It came in 5 volumes, and within it, it had more than 300 recommendations on what should move forward as far as treaty reconciliation. Within RCAP, there was a page that talked about residential schools and the government's responsibility towards them. It had been the first time that the federal government had actually acknowledged that it had a role to play in residential school harm and trauma. And as a result, there was a series of court actions that happened after RCAP came out that led to a settlement agreement that spoke to a class action that residential school survivors had organized up until that time. Within the settlement, there were actually 4 parts that the government had to respond to. And one of those parts was moving forward with the truth and reconciliation process, similar to the one that South Africa had carried out around the same time. And so, one of the reasons why it's important just to acknowledge the history leading up to this is reconciliation was a work that was carried on the shoulders of community members for decades before it actually was acknowledged by government. And at the time, government really had to be forced through the judicial system to acknowledge reconciliation. We, of course, live in a very different time where folks are very motivated to move forward with reconciling Canada's history. But leading up until that point, there was a lot of resistance. And it wasn't until there was a court mandated reconciliation process that we're actually given the opportunity as Canadians to even hear about residential schools and its history in the way that we understand it now. So from 2008 to 2015, the government did follow its court mandated responsibility to collect testimony from residential school survivors across the country. And in 2015, the final report and calls to action were released with the Truth and Reconciliation final report. Next slide. The CMA's path to reconciliation, I think, really mirrored the path that a lot of Canadians took as far as understanding and acknowledging the broad scope of the impacts of residential school experiences on First Nation, Métis, and Inuit people. After the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples was released, the CMA really started its work in reconciliation actions. There was intermittent Indigenous health advocacy and support. In the late 90s, there was a lot of projects that were going on supported by the CMA that were focused on Indigenous trainee support as well as recruitment of Indigenous professionals. As we moved into the TRC final report and its release in 2015, the CMA obviously was leaning in and making sure that it maintained its role as a collaborator and convener within the healthcare system to make sure to focus on this important emerging issue that hospitals and providers and other parts of the health system were all acting on. In 2020, we had the first Indigenous physician board member elected to the CMA board, Dr. Paula Cashin. In 2021, there's the first Indigenous student board member, Dr. Santana Hernandez. And then I was honored to represent Alberta as the first Indigenous president-elect for the CMA. In 2021, the Indigenous Guiding Circle was formed, which mirrored the patient voice, which were spaces that were set aside to make sure that both Indigenous health expertise and voice was present within the CMA, as well as patient voice. The Indigenous Guiding Circle was tasked with defining an Indigenous health goal and also recommending possible actions on reconciliation. Next slide. In 2022, the CMA board passed motions that committed to a national apology as a result of responding to the advice and direction provided by the Indigenous Guiding Circle. And in 2023, I had the honor of announcing, along with Dr. Cashin Hernandez, that the CMA was moving forward with an apology process. Those 2 years of work culminated in an apology being given in September 2024. And with that apology, there was an action plan that was associated with it that included ongoing advocacy, education, and opening the CMA Code of Ethics and Professionalism to consider anti-Indigenous racism, as well as broader forms of racism and discrimination. Now we arrive here in the present day in 2025. There's an ongoing commitment by the CMA board, and CMA presidents, including our current CMA president, Dr. Brunel, to truth and reconciliation, as well as carrying on the legacy of all the work the CMA has done over the past 10 years. Next slide. As far as putting the apology into action, focus areas that the CMA is actively working on include things like anti-racism and cultural change, policy review, and direct partner advocacy. The CMA is one of the loudest voices with the federal government and other provincial and territorial governments, and centering Indigenous health advocacy is something that the CMA continues to do. And then finally, capacity building within the CMA, not only at the governance tables that had the opportunity to hear Indigenous voices for the first time, or the Indigenous Guiding Circle, which is a safe place within the CMA for Indigenous voices to gather, but also within staff and other places within the CMA. Next slide. And with that, I'll turn it over to our current president, Dr. Brunel.
Oh, Dr. Brunel, you might be on mute.
Am I unmuted?
Yeah, there you go.
Okay, sorry, folks. Good afternoon, good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us for this important discussion. Thank you to Dr. Lafontaine for shedding light on where we are with the TRC's calls to action. The stories that survivors shared during commissions such as the TRC and the National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls cannot ever be forgotten. These reports continue to be an important driver for CMA's work in Indigenous health and advancing reconciliation in healthcare. In my president-elect year, as part of the apology to Indigenous people, I had the privilege and honor to witness and hear at Mungo Martin Hall House the sharing of stories of harms done, as well as the stories of resiliency, pride, strength, determination of the Indigenous community to overcome adversity and support others. And this has certainly grounded me in the year following and will guide my presidential year. It's important for the CMA and other colonial organizations to challenge norms, create safer processes and health systems, and preserve the right to safety and dignity for Indigenous peoples. I think you would all agree that we share a deep responsibility as settlers and members of settler organizations to help advance the calls to action at the CMA. At the CMA, we've taken some important steps and we recognize that we still have more work to do. You no doubt have some valuable ideas for how we move forward, and I look forward to hearing those today. At the CMA's Health Summit in late March, we asked physicians to reflect on the following question. Given your sphere of influence or role individually or systemically, how do you propel reconciliation with Indigenous peoples? I think this question works very well for the discussion we're having today. So I'd like to share a few of the responses we received to help get our own thinking going today. Learn, unlearn, relearn for life. We must commit to learning and educating others, recognizing that reconciliation and building cultural safety is a collaborative responsibility. We must learn how to create healing spaces. So transforming healthcare includes fostering environments where patients feel heard and respected, and where their cultural backgrounds are acknowledged and integrated into their care as much as possible. Listen, create opportunities for Indigenous voices to be heard without exception. This work is not only about inclusion, but about transformation that is Indigenous led. So Indigenous voices are not only heard, but are intentionally centered and uplifted. Adopt Joyce's principle and implement cultural safety and care across institutions. The work that reconciliation requires should be approached comprehensively and cannot be achieved through siloed or isolated efforts. As we walk the path of reconciliation, it is so important that we uphold our pledge to advance Indigenous health and well-being by learning, unlearning, relearning, and learning again how to be strong allies, rebuilding trusting relationships with Indigenous people, and creating safe spaces in healthcare. As Dr. Lafontaine touched on, some of the steps the CMA is taking include updating our code of ethics and professionalism to better reflect our shared values as physicians in supporting patients from Indigenous communities. Alongside Indigenous partners, we're calling on the federal government to reintroduce important First Nations clean water legislation and support First Nations, Inuit, and Métis-led healthcare. Through the CMA and CMA Foundation, we're building new partnerships and providing funding to support community-based Indigenous-led work. For example, I attended the Canadian Journalism Foundation Gala earlier this month, where we celebrated Leonard Monkman, the first recipient of the Indigenous Health Journalism Foundation, supported by the CMA. Through this fellowship, we hope to highlight crucial health issues affecting Indigenous communities in Canada, and he will be studying the HIV crisis in Indigenous communities. That gala was absolutely amazing. It highlighted the role of storytelling, of journalism, the process of conveying the truth, the powers of storytelling to build bridges and break down barriers, the opportunity to listen deeply, reflect, and to work on deepening our understanding of those people around us, exemplified by Indigenous journalists that were present and recognized for their achievements. We are also grateful to be benefiting from the guidance of Dr. Lafontaine in his new role as Indigenous Advisor in residence to bring more diverse perspectives to our decision making. He's certainly willing to share his experiences, to listen, and to help us to gain that important knowledge. As individuals, we have power and we have agency. We can help make changes happen. And when we come together as a profession, that impact can be even greater. So to that end, I am glad to see so many of you joining us to learn from one another and share our experience as we collectively take concrete action to advance reconciliation. I'm personally very much looking forward to what our speakers will be sharing with us and the discussion that will follow. Thank you, Merci Miigwech.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Burnell. And before I introduce our panelists, just want to thank everybody that's participated in the chat so far, providing suggestions around how to start in terms of jumping in, recommendations for education and training, connecting with organizations, or even just finding a friend I saw. So really just encourage you to please keep looking at the chat and participating. We really just want to hear from you, but most importantly, have you hear from each other because the people are at all sorts of different parts of their reconciliation journey. So I'd just like to introduce our panelists. So I'll start with Dr. Gabrielle de Weber, who is a volunteer with Grandmother's Voice, which is an Indigenous-led organization aimed at amplifying voices to share Indigenous teachings and practices more broadly. She's a pediatric neurologist at the Hospital for Sick Children, where she built the Children's Stroke Program. It is considered to be a pioneer in the field of pediatric stroke internationally. In recent years, Dr. De Weber joined Grandmother's Voice as a non-Indigenous ally supporting two-eyed seeing, a blending of Western approaches and traditional Indigenous approaches to building relationships and delivering healthcare in Indigenous people. And secondly, we have Dr. Cassandra Felsky-Durskin. She is Otipemisiwak, sorry, and a citizen of Métis Nation within Alberta. She's a family physician in Edmonton and chair of the Alberta Medical Association's Indigenous Health Committee. Her areas of interest include decolonization and Indigenous self-determination in health and healthcare delivery. Her practice largely focuses on sexual and reproductive health within a tight and dynamic interdisciplinary setting situated within culturally and community-informed principles. So welcome to you both, and thanks for your time today. And with that, I'd also like to invite back Dr. Alika Lafontaine, who will be moderating this portion of the session.
Thank you very much, Tristan. And it's an absolute pleasure to be here with two folks on both sides of the reconciliation equation who are making big differences in their community. And maybe we can start off there. Maybe we can start off with you, Cass, and then move on to Gabrielle. Maybe you can tell us a little bit more about the work that you're doing in your community and for Indigenous communities, and maybe link that back to the TRC and how the calls to action have influenced your work going forward over the time that you've been
This is a
you've
big
been in it.
question, Alika. Oh my
It
goodness.
is. It is.
Tell me about everything that you're doing. Happy to. First, I just want to socially locate myself, and a big thank you to Dr. Wyman, who popped in the chat just to comment about distinctions-based approaches and understanding the diversity of Indigenous peoples within Canada. And so I'm so deeply humbled and honored to be here today, and just would like to introduce myself as I was taught. My name is Cassandra Felsky-Durskin. Felsky is my mother's name. Durskin is my father's name. I am Otipemisiwak and a citizen of the Métis Nation within Alberta, and it's Otipemisiwak Métis government, the first of its kind in settler Canada, formed specifically for nation-to-nation modern treaty negotiation. My maternal grandmother is Veronica Flett. My Cookham's Mushum signed script in Fort Vermilion in 1899. And I have kinship ties all over the northern prairies and subarctic of Turtle Island, including, of course, the Red River and its rebellion. It's an absolute pleasure to be here today. My work is driven by my family. And I'm very fortunate to be a mama Cass to three Samoan inspiring infuriating children who every day challenge me to reflect on my social location as an Otipemisiwak physician. I grew up in a matriarchal family in a matriarchal society, and my role so far as I've been asked to by the Otipemisiwak community is to be an amplifier and an echo. I'm a giant megaphone. So none of my thought is original thought. All of these anecdotes are not even my own stories. These are stories that I was fortunate enough to bear witness to. And so I like to say I stand on the shoulders of giants, but I do not represent them. And so those teachings and that ask from community, and I will continue to do it as long as it's being asked of me, really guides all of my work, my clinical work, academic work, and administrative work. So the first thing that I would say, the first response that I would offer, Alika, is that reconciliation is not a destination, it is a journey, and it is a living journey. And that is, I think, part of what can be so scary about it. So when I first started my training, I'm a white presenting cisgender androphilic Otipemisiwak woman, and I was a trainee. And so my relationship with patients when I encountered them, or my relationship with other, First Nations, Métis, and Inuit stakeholders and representatives in administrative, academic, and community work, it was very interesting in the sense that I feel like a lot of things were said that without the recognition or knowledge that I have lived experience as an Indigenous person. And it really guided me in my work. I had to practice a lot of self-reflection and learn a lot about the more contemporary medical history, those living colonial legacies that we were not taught in medical school. And that's, the CMA's reconciliation journey, that historical review is so critical because we don't know and don't realize the last Indian hospital in Canada closed in 1996. And that was Charles Council here in Edmonton. And so for the last 8 years that I've been back in Edmonton since completing my training has been learning about the council, and not from textbooks or websites, but from community, and listening to my patients as they tell their stories of their experiences with council. So really a lot of my work is guided through that oral knowledge. And in order for us to establish a therapeutic alliance with patients or a relationship with communities, it requires us to just as it was stated before, unlearn a lot of what we've learned. So in terms of the TRC calls to action, I think, Alika, the ones that speak to me and where I see the most action is around education. I didn't know what I didn't know as an Indigenous trainee and physician, and now I'm learning things that terrify me and completely explain where the tension is coming from. And now I feel obligated to share that information with my colleagues because I've made so many missteps in my career, and I continue to, and I will every day, and I will continue to apologize every day for my missteps. But if I can learn from those missteps and share that with my colleagues so that maybe they can have a little bit of that extra advantage in relationship building and alliance building, that that I think will make a difference in terms of really actioning those health specific calls to action.
What a wonderful way to ground uh, the conversation at the beginning, just really talking about who you are and where you're from and how you came to the knowledge that you have, and then turning that back to the TRC. Uh, Gabrielle, maybe you could tell us about yourself.
Sure. Well, I am a settler origin woman. I do not have blood relatives who are Indigenous. And I have retired from clinical practice a few years ago, 2 years ago, at which time my interest bloomed in trying to make a difference for deep wrongs that have been committed with the Indigenous peoples. So that was my backdrop. Before I came into this way of being, I knew about the surface level history of Indigenous people, embarrassingly, not nearly enough. And I come from a family. My mom was an artist. She worked with Indigenous artists and was very ecology oriented as well. And I remember in public school being befriended by an Indigenous young woman from a pregnant woman's home next door, and her just being a very key element in my schooling. She sort of protected me when things were going badly and bullying. So I had a personal affiliation already with Indigenous people, but I had been busy, busy, busy as we all are with our career and training and running my lab, and had learned along those years about the importance of collaboration, the importance of listening rather than just speaking. Um, but I came into this world, this Indigenous allyship role, knowing essentially almost nothing. Like I had done the Coursera course at the U of Alberta. I had done some reading, braiding sweetgrass. Everything I read, everything I heard just flamed up my desire to try and make a difference. The challenge was, how do I do that? I am one person. I am not deeply connected or in any way connected to Indigenous people. So where do I even start? And so that was the beginning of this. And what I did is having retired, I was now able to spend some time looking at places in the north where I might be of benefit. And so I started, emailing up in the north. Can I be of any help? I'll volunteer. I'm happy to do anything. Um, that just, didn't seem to work. And then one day I found an online invitation to a film opening by an Indigenous filmmaker in Oakville, where I live. And so in Oakville, Grandmother's Voice existed. So it was kind of ironic that all that time I'd been looking afar for a way to connect. And then here was this organization next door. So that began what's been a 2-year collaboration. And in that collaboration, I've played the role of basically a learner mainly, and with great humility, understanding that I do not bring wisdom to this. I do not bring solution. What I bring is some energy and some skill as a scientific. I'm a scientist at the Research Institute, and so there were some grants that we could write together. There were some ways that I could be of help because of my knowledge in the brain when we were having elder teaching on trauma and the effect on the brain. I had spent my career looking after children with physical trauma, stroke in the brain, and learning about neuroplasticity, and then was able to see the difference, that the difference isn't great between physical trauma and emotional and spiritual trauma, which is at least a big part of what's been inflicted in the Indigenous peoples. So as I've gone through this 2 years, I have been incredibly grateful because I have had lots and lots of hours with the elders of Grandmother's Voice, Grandmother Renee and Grandmother Gail, Dennis Windigo, some of the other elders, and been participant and witness to their teaching. And everything I know has been really learned by story through them. The book learning, which was my usual MO, when I want to find out something new, I research and I find the books and I read it and I think I know. But this was very different from that. So that's the first thing, is that this is really about verbal learning, and it's about story. And the missteps that I've made, also very significant missteps. Even with the best of intentions, not understanding the community base for which research must be conducted. So I've done some outside learning and worked with some additional people, an Indigenous elder who knows about research, and some other people to try and understand what is the difference in doing research. So the first misstep was during one of our course teachings, where Dennis Windigo teaches land-based focusing oriented trauma psychotherapy, and he did his first year last year. I was a volunteer at that, and got very excited about the fact that they needed to certify it. So we knew, myself and another white settler woman who was a professor, we said, well, we can just put together a survey and we'll find out, we'll get the survey back from these 27 Indigenous psychotherapists who are here training. And and so Dennis said, you're going to have to get some input on that. Oh, of course, we'll let them know all about it. And so at that last session of our 21-day teaching, we launched the idea. And I said, oh, we have a survey. We'd really be grateful for your input on how the course went. And there was such an emotional reaction, like a serious reaction from a couple of the people in the room. Like, wait a minute, research? You want to do research? And then it just seemed to trigger this whole reaction. And it was actually personally quite traumatic for me because, it was like a public shutting down, but I understood it. And my response was, look, I completely get it. Why wouldn't you be angry? I get it. So I withdraw the suggestion and let's go back at this a different way. And then I had the help of a couple of the elders to see how research cannot be, there's a history of traumatic research that's been done, and some of it by pediatricians from Toronto who went into an Indigenous who went into one of the residential homes and said, "Oh, these children are malnourished. Why don't we do a study and we'll just nourish half of them and not nourish the other half, and then we'll compare the effects," if you can even imagine that. So the amount of shame and guilt that I carry as a settler woman for inflicted harms too deeply traumatic to even talk about sometimes is huge. And like that's been the other lesson I've learned, is that there is there is such deep trauma when you look into what's been done, that it's very hard to stay neutral and find the way forward, because it's almost vicariously traumatic to read about the inflictions on these children. So I found that very emotionally upsetting, and I've had to really work on my healing to stay in the stream. My vision of what I want to accomplish is really summarized in some ways by the Turo Wampum, in that I do not in any way believe that I am Indigenous. I do not have any pretensions that I can become Indigenous. I can't, but I can be in my boat, traveling my path through the river, and then alongside me, the Indigenous people in their canoe. And as most of us know, in the 1600s, that was the first agreement on how to be together now that the settlers arrived in North America. And it started treaty making. And so we learn from the Indigenous. So that's my third lesson, is that most of what we know or think we know is based in a way of viewing the world that is not the correct way. This idea that white people are in some implicit way superior is wrong. And every colonial structure that we have, which is all of our education, all of our hospitals, all of our government, is imbued with that same, I think, incorrect view that we are the base, we are the normal, and Indigenous, Black, any other race are other in some way. And so having to blow open that idea of the structure of a colonial grant giving community, health giving community like a hospital, um, I think that's been a huge learning for me, is that how deep this misconception actually runs. And so I'm extremely grateful to be part of any action that's helping to make things better. I'm very humble about it. I know that when I treat an Indigenous patient, my statement needs to be, I am not Indigenous. I can't know what this is like for you. I'll probably make mistakes, but I'm going to try my best. And Dennis taught me that, Dennis Windigo. And I think that kind of summarizes the approach that I have taken when I'm working with new Indigenous people. It's all about relationship building. So with that, I'll turn the mic back over.
Yeah, thanks, Gabrielle. Just a note to folks that are participating, make sure you read through the chat. There's resources that are being dropped in and questions that are being asked. We'll try and keep an eye on that just to inform the conversation. And there will be an opportunity for us to pick up some questions, maybe one or two from the chat as well. So really encourage you to participate there. Um, the opening statements from both of you kind of have me thinking a lot about that there's work for people to do on both sides, both folks who are Indigenous and those who are not Indigenous. Um, Sometimes when I look at system transformation within healthcare, um, a parallel I sometimes make is like people who actually are living the problems versus people that are inside the system trying to fix the problems, right? And sometimes you get people who have a blended identity like UCAS who are both living the problems and trying to solve them. And there's folks like you, Gabrielle, who are firmly trying to be allies to kind of pick up the things that they should pick up. Inside the chat, there was some discussion about a paradigm that's been brought forward through thought leadership from our Western cousins, talking about, cedar baskets and copper pots, the idea that there are things that we should pick up and things that we should let other folks pick up. When you think about understanding what you needed to pick up, both of you have talked about mistakes and things that you learned. What have you learned about what you need to pick up? And I think one other part of that question is, how do you know how to pick it up in coordination with the other person? Because I think that that's sometimes something that's lost in that dichotomy. We both think that both sides are going to pick up stuff and things are going to work out. Like even with the two-row wampum, you have two people looking side by side. You're actually supposed to look at the other side. You're supposed to pay attention to, what they're doing and how they're approaching things so you can respond in kind. And maybe we could start off with you, Cass. What have you learned about what you need to pick up? And what have you learned about working with people who are picking up things that you shouldn't or can't?
I'm going to give maybe an unhelpful answer.
All
It
answers
might
are
be
helpful at some
a
level.
diverting answer.
Yeah.
So, I don't know what to pick up. I don't. This is kind of unprecedented territory. Never in history have we been in this particular situation. So, um, I would say that even before looking at what needs to be picked up and just reflecting on some of Gabrielle's comments around, the trauma, and it's not shared trauma, and that's what makes it particularly difficult as well. As an Indigenous person, I for sure live the problem. I come into this world with an A score, an adverse childhood event score of 8. And by those statistics, and we could certainly talk about some of the ACE scores are great. We could talk about some of the criticisms of the ACE score and its applications to oppressed populations, and in particular, Indigenous populations within settler Canada. But just to quantify it right out of the gate, I come with lived experience, 100%. Um, and then the experience of our medical training, and this is both for Indigenous people and non-Indigenous people. Our training historically has been very shame-based, and we experience a lot of trauma throughout our training that is never really addressed through a healing centered lens. Really, a lot of it, I don't know about you two and everyone here, a lot of, things that I've witnessed or even, participated in were never really debriefed. And so when we look at what do we pick up, I think a lot of it has to do with where we're at in our own healing journey. We default to shame so quickly because we are fear conditioned through our training, to be the expert, to know the right answer, to know what to do, to know what to pick up and how to pick it up and when to pick it up and who to pick it up with. And the fact that this is very uncomfortable and it's kind of messy and it's not our fault. We didn't create this situation. We inherited this situation. I'm very comfortable being critical of my physician predecessors for um, how they perpetuated things like white supremacy through racial pseudoscience, and how sometimes that continues to show up in our training without even realizing it, that unspoken curriculum or listing indigeneity as a risk factor to our health. Indigeneity is not a risk factor to my health. Being Otipemisiwak is a protective factor to my health. And so even when I raise that comment, in conversations around certain projects or initiatives, a lot of non-Indigenous colleagues have kind of that fear or shame-based response, realizing, oh man, like sometimes I do refer to indigeneity as a risk factor. I did too in my training, and I'm on my learning journey too of decolonizing my medical practice, my academic practice, my administrative practice. And that's where that concept of cultural humility comes from. It's so challenging for us to address that kind of fear conditioned response of, I need to do this the right way. And I need to do this with the right people and at the right time. It really, people go into fight, flight, or freeze like legitimately. And you can see in colleagues' responses when they're in that place and space. And for me as an Indigenous physician, administrator, and academic or scholar, a lot of the work that I've been doing is recognizing when I'm slamming myself into the shame shack, and then also recognizing when my colleagues are in the shame shack and holding space for each other. And my approach, and I recognize a few names in our audience today, and I'm sure that they could tell you, my approach is just to name it and to have those conversations and say, we may not get this right the first go around. We need a lot of guidance. We can't do this on our own. Nothing about us without us. So we have to engage, and get that guidance from others, from those that are most impacted, the Indigenous peoples that are most impacted by this project or initiative. And that all on its own, that concept of engagement requires us to practice cultural humility. And what I've come to learn, being someone who's lived almost her whole life in the shame shack, professionally and personally, is that once you're able to relinquish that hold that we have on needing to be the expert, to be right, to not make mistakes, to not make missteps, and say, I'm not the expert in this room. I'm not the expert in this city. I'm not the expert in this province. There's a lot of people here that need to weigh in. I'm not a leader, I'm a facilitator. That's one of my other favorite catchphrases. Once you relinquish that, and that's not easy, that's not done overnight, that's done through like trauma counseling and other things. It's so liberating. It is absolutely liberating. And one of the questions I get so often too is, especially when it comes to clinical practice and clinical practice transformation change, the medical legal liabilities around that. And I always point them to the CMPA's good practices on cultural safety and patient relations and things like that, because there is such really good literature being put out by the CMPA that reflects this concept of us practicing cultural humility and acknowledging Indigenous patients, families, and communities as the experts. So when it comes to the work and who picks up what when, it's not a simple answer. This is like a very unhelpful non-answer answer. I'm sorry, Alika. But,
We
I
are
don't,
physicians.
right? I don't know when. And sometimes I pick something up and then I do a backtrack and I consult with those that who guide me in this work, community mentors and physician mentors, and use my community of practice, and my community of person as that sounding board in case I am off in left field. And so with that too, again, just to reiterate, because you asked that question about like collaboration, right? And recognizing that our non-Indigenous colleagues and allies want to do this work too, and they're scared too. Um, it's just having that conversation, recognizing that. And I feel like personally for me, as soon as you name it and you name the elephant in the room, like I don't know what I'm doing and I'm flying by the seat of my pants, then it makes it so much easier to find those creative solutions for getting that input and guidance.
Gabrielle.
Wow. I echo what Cassandra said. I think um, the relief in not being the leader and not being the ideas person is tremendous. I've enjoyed that side of this work. I enjoy taking my cue from the elders. That's always kind of my default. Um, I also have become more spiritually guided, so that helps me know, or gives me a kind of a compass internally about where should I go, where should I not go. I usually err on the side of humility, like it's not my place. But I also, if I'm encouraged, I do offer ideas. But I just know that I'm not in charge, and I'm not, um, as Cassandra said, and the other way of saying it is nothing for us without us. And um, that is true for the Indigenous people. That's true for Black people. It's true for any oppressed people. Um, yeah, so I think I take my cue very much from either the spiritual path that I've been on. I've been gifted by having a lot of time in ceremony with the elders and sweats and having a lot of teachings, and I've been just like a thirsty sponge, sort of pulling that up. So that's given me a awareness, and I think yeah, as I said, a compass to help me find that tricky balance between I want to be helpful, but it's maybe not my place to propose something. I think the relationship building allows a better sense of when we're to pick something up and when we're not to. It for me, a lot of it is about the relationship building and the willingness to just keep coming back and fold pamphlets and serve coffee and step away from the role of the physician and the scientist and the whatever, just to come in as a human being with a heart and a willingness and a humility. I don't know if that answered your question, but
No,
Alika, can I respond to that
go
really
ahead, Cass.
quickly too? Sorry, I know I'm like breaking the circle, but I I also, like thank you for that, Gabrielle, and I think that it's really important to share and state that, the role of ally is so important and none of I don't think that I've accomplished anything. I think that I've facilitated a lot of great people doing a lot of great work. But uh, where allies are particularly critical and essential is making space for Indigenous knowledge and practices. And Gabrielle, you reflected a lot on kind of like how the uh, white Euro-Canadian culture has become status quo and has been normalized. And it's hard for those who are maybe earlier on their journey to see where there's opportunity to create space, right? And that sounds like such a very amorphous term, making space, but those who are on their journey and who have done it know what it means. And looking at something as simple as how are we checking patients in our clinic, right? How are we responding to them on the phone? How are we rooming them? How do you make space for Indigenous approaches to checking patients in and responding on the phone and rooming them? And we can look at examples in policy. We can look at examples in organization, infrastructure, and processes. That aspect of making space, I could come and I could knock on the door for a decade, but if space isn't made, it's hard for me to bring in the knowledge keepers who can bring in those Indigenous ways of knowing and being. So I really do feel that not to decenter Indigenous peoples in this discussion, Indigenous knowledges and practices, but to say that allyship is absolutely critical to this work, to make space and to hold space.
yeah. If I could just say briefly something, Alika, is that okay?
Oh yeah, for sure. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. I love what you just said, Cass. I think that is another role that I play as the advocate, meaning, okay, now outside of the Indigenous circle, I can knock on doors, as you said, and I can like go to sick kids, to the Indigenous navigator and say, do you need support? Are you making any headway? Do you need me to, go and talk to the head of pediatrics and talk about the fire safety issues? Or how can I be an advocate to facilitate what you need to do? That advocacy also comes through when I speak about allyship to healthcare groups, and I say each of you belongs to a professional association, whether it's the Social Workers Association of Canada, excuse me, or the CMA in our case, or the RNAO, whatever it is. There's a group that you can advocate within. When you go to your annual meeting, bring it up, put it on the agenda. How do we create a culturally safe space for our Indigenous clients? How do we do that? Um, One of the things I find people are very thirsty for, and I would love to hear from Cassandra and maybe Alika about this, and it was also one of our pre-questions, is what practical steps can a physician make to make their own office a culturally safe space? Because as Cassandra said, we are in a very powerful place. Like the healthcare system, from the time you walk up to the emergency room desk for check-in, there is so much power in that person sitting there. And it can be power used for good, or if they're having a bad day and they have a preconceived racial stereotype and they haven't had some education, it can be very badly used. And from the beginning to the end, and then at the higher levels, the policy and how that's based in a colonial approach. It just, it's like, anyway, I don't, in terms of the practical stuff, having the four medicines available. When do you ask an Indigenous, a client, if you're Indigenous, you can let me know and it's safe? Like, how do you get around that?
Yeah, and I think I'll maybe modify that question just a little bit. Um, when you two think about where to go to learn these things, where do you go? Because I think that's probably a question that's underneath the surface of a lot of folks who are, listening to this right now. Like, where do you literally go? Who do you talk to? How do you know that they're telling you things that would actually be helpful? And I think I'll just acknowledge too in the chat, as part of this. Nell Wyman's been participating in the chat, and Nell, me and Cass are in the same generation of leaders, I'd say, but Nell's in the generation before us of Indigenous leaders. Nell, Barry LaValle, the late Tom Dignan, so many other folks whose shoulders we stand on, who actually put in the work over those decades to create opportunities for us to have impact. um, in going to those places and finding out um, the good way to go about doing this work. How do you also differentiate between people who come from very different backgrounds? First Nation, Inuit and Métis are have very different places and paths that they've taken to the trauma that they underwent, and the trauma was different as well. In
Mhm.
some places they were shared, and other places they're very, very different. And so, just the question, Cass, and then maybe Gabrielle, where would you go to learn those things? And then how do you, how do you go through the process of learning about different problems and different paths to those problems with kind of the Indigenous specific way of approaching, health system change that I think's really been advocated quite a bit over the last few years.
Yeah, Alika, that's such a good question. And a lot of the work that I've been doing administratively and academically is just recognizing the amount of burnout and compassion fatigue that like we're in a bit of a national physician crisis. I think we can all relate to this here. Providing, educational material that is humility driven, that is culturally informed, that is high impact for a clinical setting, and that is easy and quick to read. And it's like very antithetical to Indigenous ways of knowing and sharing knowledge to make it quick and easy in a read. But in terms of some of the quality improvement and quality assurance items that have come across my desk in recent years, it's come to my attention that sometimes those micro learning opportunities are actually the way to get your foot in the door for bigger learning for certain groups and departments and clinics and organizations and academic spaces. Um, and so I feel like I'm sorry, I'm a broken record on this one, Alika, but it's really patients, families, and community feedback. And like quite literally, I will, if I feel like I don't want to be extractive by like battering every patient and family with feedback, a request for feedback, right? Because that's my job. It's my learning journey. I need to take responsibility and ownership for it. But when patients express discontent with how an encounter went, or, I've had patients for 45 minutes tell me how they did not enjoy the question that I just asked, and then give me feedback on how I could have asked it differently. I take that and I take that to heart and I put it in my toolkit and I carry it with me and then I share it with others. And then if there's consistent feedback that I'm hearing, and I'm very fortunate that Alberta Health Services continues to employ me in two administrative roles, actually. And now the AMA has, has me for now facilitating the Indigenous Health committee. I can take kind of the pattern of feedback, consistent feedback that I'm hearing from patients, from family, from community, and say, this is a consistent thing that I'm hearing. And this isn't anecdotal research, this is community voices, and we need to pay attention to this. The other piece that's really critical and really important to acknowledge, especially for organizations, the lack of feedback does not mean you're doing a good job, to put it very bluntly. Quite often, if there is a paucity of feedback from Indigenous community, that means that the feedback process is not considered safe. It's not landing as safe. We want people to give us feedback, and we want to create a space and a process that allows that feedback to come to us and come to us in a good way. That doesn't reflect our way of collecting feedback, but reflects the way of the local Indigenous people or the community or family that we're working with, how they typically provide feedback. And so I actually, once I start hearing more, and this is for sure one of what's, considered maybe a hiccup for organizations or departments, they start hearing more negative feedback and they're saying we're doing a worse job. Like we're trying to help and we're not helping. And I have to say, no, this this doesn't feel good, but this is actually a good thing because it means that we're opening up these lines of communication, we're building relationship. You're muted, Alika.
Sorry, I was just saying, go ahead, Gabrielle.
Well, I don't have much to add to that. I think, it comes back to a combination of things. So the way it's been working, and hopefully it's working well, is that, Jody Wilson, not Jody Harbour, who's the co-founder of Grandmother's Voice, she will have an opportunity and an invitation, let's say, from an organization. They will say, we're interested in decolonizing in some way. And, many, many opportunities like that end up just being like a prescriptive checkbox thing. What's the minimum we can do to say we've decolonized? So it gets a little bit jaded over time, but she will invite me to the table for particular things that are related to healthcare. And because of this is where, as an ally and being an advocate, I can have a voice um, alongside the Indigenous voice. I am not the Indigenous voice, but where I can cull from the literature because I am a researcher. And for example, I'll give you an example. In Ontario, the Ontario Structured Psychotherapy program is being promoted for free psychotherapy for Ontarians. And we asked them, what are you doing to make it Indigenous? They said, well, we plan to pilot it with Indigenous people, but they're not changing the OSP. So that's the only free psychotherapy available to urban Indigenous people. So, I called the scientist who had started the OSP plan with some evidence that I pulled from the literature showing that um, that cognitive-based psychotherapy is not very effective or appropriate really for Indigenous populations because it's not aligned with Indigenous ways of being. So calling people, asking them to, consider another way. You have an opportunity to harmonize OSP with another way. Maybe, the psychotherapy, the land-based psychotherapy could be part of it. Could it be incorporated in? Could we braid together some of the Western versus the Indigenous approaches to psychotherapy? And then at other tables to sit and Ontario Health was another call we had where, I know from my past experience as a scientist working with them, wanting to make pediatric stroke on the agenda and how difficult that was, that one of the strategies to talking to Ontario Health is to say, you are very research based. Ontario Health is very research based. Therefore, let's look at the research. And here is some of the research showing that Indigenous run healthcare in different communities, particularly in BC, who are ahead of the curve, I think, has absolutely clear benefits over Western healthcare. So if you're evidence-based, then let's look at the evidence. And so having, the Masters of Epidemiology and some of those research skills allows me to hold feet to the fire in a way that, is helpful, hopefully.